Hello, welcome to a new edition of the Right Wing Populist Podcast. I am the sick right wing populist. I am under the weather, folks. You can probably hear it in my voice. I apologize. But the show must go on. The show must go on. I don't know, maybe it shouldn't go on. But I think I sound well enough. Maybe you guys will appreciate the deeper voice. Maybe I sound sexier. I got more sex appeal now going on with my voice. I don't know. But we're going to try this out. And if you want to skip this episode because of my voice, I understand. It'll probably be a little bit of a shorter podcast because of my voice, but I still want to do a podcast today. There may or may not be a podcast tomorrow, the weekly wrap, which is the longer format podcast, just because it's going to depend on my voice and how I'm feeling. My throat isn't particularly sore, but my voice is raspy. So, like I said, we're going to try this out. But the topic I want to discuss today is left-wing populism. You know, I hear this trope from the left and this idea that right-wing populism doesn't exist, but that's not true. The real populism that doesn't exist is left-wing populism. That's the fraud. And I want to discuss that. But before we get into it all, I want you to subscribe, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to this not so amazing today audio experience. I'd really appreciate it. So before we get into left-wing populism versus right-wing populism, let's talk about what populism is. What exactly is populism? Well, to me, I've always described populism, and I am the right-wing populist, so I can talk about this. I've always considered populism the concept of putting the needs of the working men and women over the needs of the elite, and always having a healthy skepticism of power and skepticism of the elites. Whether these elites work in big government or big business, there's a skepticism of institutions, a skepticism of power, and the point of populism ultimately is put the needs of, again, the working men and women over the needs of the elite. Now, if you go into academia, you're at college, you listen to these libtard media outlets, a lot of times they'll describe populism as more of a rhetoric game, as more of a way to convince the masses to vote for you. Many times right-wing populism will be described as basically fascism because they view it more as a rhetorical tool instead of actually a way to implement policies that help working people. And I disagree. Again, I think populism, the point of populism is to ultimately, yes, it's a rhetoric game in part because you got to get the working class men and women on your side. But the point of it ultimately is to get the power so you can implement policies to benefit the working man and women. Whether that's tariffs to protect jobs from not going overseas, whether that's implementing certain social policies to make sure that the institutions of marriage isn't degraded. So we have a society where, children grow up with two parents. It stabilizes the country, particularly working class homes. That's more of a right-wing perspective, but that is populism. The home, the family unit, that's extremely important from a right-wing populist perspective. But you see this on many left-wing commentators. They will just outright say that right-wing populism doesn't exist. And the reason they'll say this is because they make the claim that many times it is just a rhetoric game on the right, whether it's Josh Hawley or even Donald Trump. But once, they'll talk a big game in terms of populism and looking out for the everyday man and woman. But once they get into office, they just serve the interests of the elite. And therefore, according to many people on the left, people like Kyle Kalinske, that idiot, Crystal Ball, that retard, the idiot and retard, they're married together, by the way, so I guess it makes sense. They found their they found their partners, and They discovered their love for each other because of their true idiocracy that they share. They're both idiots. So that's the claim that these people are not real populists because they claim that Donald Trump, Josh Hawley, they don't really care about the working men and women. They use populist rhetoric to trick them. So once they get into power, they can then serve the interests of the elite. So I first want to attack this idea that Donald Trump isn't a populist, and then I want to get into why, if anything, left-wing populism is the populism that's a fraud. First off, Donald Trump is a populist. most people, even people on the left, would acknowledge he's certainly a populist given his rhetoric. He's rhetorically certainly a populist. In pretty much all three of his campaigns, he campaigned against the establishment, particularly the last one. The establishment was trying to put him in jail. It's kind of hard to argue you're not a populist or a threat to the system when the system's trying to put you in jail. They indicted him 4 times, mostly over bullshit. So the idea that the system didn't view him as a threat is obviously not true. Just look at his first term. You had Russiagate. Russiagate was a way to try to prevent Trump from implementing his more populist policies, like being anti-war and trying to get along with Russia. You have to remember this. Trump was an outsider, so when he got elected the first time, it was really him versus the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy is what prevented these populist policies from being implemented to the extent Trump would have liked. Some of his generals, like General Milley, they admitted to lying to Trump about different troop levels and countries. He was being undermined constantly. You had the Mueller probe, the impeachments. The fact that Trump didn't implement his populist agenda to the extent he campaigned on, that really wasn't his fault fundamentally. It was the fault of the bureaucracy. And, his second term, he's not been as populist as I would like, to be honest, in all fairness. But he's still facing massive friction against the administrative state. And he's trying to implement populist policies. The tariff policy is classic populism, protecting jobs. Whether you agree with tariffs or not, it is a classic populist policy. Both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders ran on tariffs in 2016 because that is a populist policy. And this kind of gets me to the second point, and why I think really left-wing populism is the populism that's fake, is because whenever you have a quote-unquote left-wing populist get in a position of power, you still don't have populist policies implemented, even though the bureaucracy is on their side. The bureaucracy is on the left. The bureaucracy didn't resist Barack Obama the way they resisted Donald Trump. And that's because Obama was the fake populist, and Trump was the real one. Obama ran as a populist in 2008 and 2012, but he didn't deliver on his populism. He bailed out Wall Street. He didn't hold them accountable to the financial crisis. He bailed them out. He didn't take troops out of the Middle East. He increased our presence in the Middle East. We were in 3 wars when he got into office. When Obama left office, we were in 7. He got us involved in Yemen. He got us involved in Syria. He dramatically escalated the drone program. He wasn't a populist. He was a fraud. Barack Hussein Obama was a fucking fraud. Okay, he campaigned as a populist. Look at his 2008 speeches. But he did not govern like one. And unlike Trump, he was not facing the resistance to implement populist policies. Even Obamacare, that was a giant blowjob to the insurance companies. How is that populism? That didn't benefit working class people. At least if he had actually implemented a single payer system, whether you agree with that or not, you would still have the pretext of that being more of a populist policy. But Obamacare, that just benefited the insurance companies. It didn't even benefit your everyday worker or, everyday man or woman, because the premiums are too fucking high. And again, it just benefited the insurance companies. So Obama was not a populist, but he didn't have the pushback that Trump had. I cannot emphasize this enough. If Obama had really wanted to, given his huge victory in 2008, if he had wanted to govern as a populist, he could have. He was a transformational figure, the first black president. And he gets into office and he becomes a cuck to the establishment immediately with no fight. At least Trump fought back against the establishment for all his faults. He's been fighting against them for 10 years. And the reason the establishment has been fighting him is because he's an actual populist. And he's by far the most populist president we've had in decades, Donald Trump. He was the first president during his first term not to start a new war in decades. He was actually the first president to really try to hold China accountable for their stealing of our intellectual policy, the stealing of our jobs. He put tariffs on China that the Biden administration actually kept on. That's how good they were. He cut taxes for working class people. It was one of the biggest tax cuts for working class people. His 2017 Trump tax cuts. He cut regulations for small businesses. He cut immigration dramatically, illegal immigration, which helps working class people because many times illegal immigrants will compete for the same type of jobs. And then look at Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, he ran as a populist in 2016 and 2020, but he ultimately cucked to the system. He got screwed over. He was cheated in 2016. Hillary Clinton stole that Democrat primary from him. And he still endorsed her after that. He literally got cheated. It was proven by WikiLeaks, all the information, the way they rigged the primary against him. The DNC was totally rigged against Bernie Sanders. Everyone knows it. They were giving Hillary the debate questions. They were purposely putting debates in time slots where people couldn't see. They had this ridiculous delegate system where Bernie would win a state by like 10 points, but Hillary would still get the majority of the delegates because of superdelegates. It was ridiculous. And then Bernie endorsed her. And this is the populist champion. This is the real populist champion, Bernie Sanders. Even better than Barack Obama. He's the real one, not Trump. It's Bernie Sanders. But then he cucks to Hillary Clinton. And then in 2020, after Obama basically manipulates the primary to make sure Biden's the winner, Bernie still endorses Biden. This is this populist challenger. And the reality is, putting aside specific politicians like Bernie or Obama, the reality is many left-wing populist policies, they benefit the bureaucracy because it grows government. That's what the bureaucracy wants. Because if the government grows, they're going to get paid more and there's going to be more jobs for their friends and buddies and their job is secure. And the bureaucracy is the establishment, folks. I understand that corporate interest is also part of the establishment, and that's the blind spot on the right. Sometimes the right is too dismissive of the risk of corporate power. But at the end of the day, the government's the one that can threaten you with a gun. Corporations can't. They're the ones who can arrest your ass, throw you in jail, even without a trial. It's the government. That's why the government's the biggest threat to liberty, not big business. Big business can be, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, it's the government that has the guns. They're the ones who can use force, not corporations. And left-wing, quote-unquote, populist policies grow the bureaucracy. They don't shrink it. And the bureaucracy is the thing that is preventing populist policies. That's why Trump has struggled to implement his whole populist agenda, particularly in his first term and even in his second term. Now, I'm not trying to remove agency from Trump. Trump's made bad decisions. Bombing Iran was a bad decision. It was not a populist thing to do, whether you agree with it or not. But there's no question Trump has been fighting the bureaucracy for the last 10 years in a way that no left-wing populist, quote-unquote, would ever, because the bureaucracy doesn't fear left-wing populism because it benefits them. And they know that their agenda isn't actually going to hurt the elite. Tax increases on corporations, who cares? That's just more money for the government and the bureaucracy. And at the end of the day, the media is on their side. The establishment's on the Democrat Party side. So at the end of the day, it's not in the left's interest to really upend the apple cart and destroy the corrupt establishment because they directly benefit from it because the establishment supports the left. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. And that's not even getting to the fact that many left-wing populists on social issues are just insane. They believe in transgendered everything, as Trump would say. They believe in affirmative action, discrimination against whites, etc. They fundamentally don't believe in the family unit. They want to use big government programs to overcompensate for there not being a man in the household, for example. So the policy is no good. It benefits the bureaucracy. And ultimately, the bureaucracy doesn't view the left as a threat to power because the establishment is the left. I mean, Kamala Harris won voters who are making over $100K a year this past election. Okay, I cannot emphasize this enough. That maybe 20 years ago this would be a different story, but in today's political dynamics, it's the left that is the establishment, not the right. So, look, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I'm not saying left-wing populism doesn't exist, period. There's many voters who are left-wing populists or left-leaning populists who deeply care about combating the corruption and looking out for your working men and women. I totally understand that. I don't want to be a hypocrite. But the reality is, if you look at the history of people running for president or just elected officials in general on the left who position themselves as populists, they're the ones who ultimately betray the voters. At least on the right, you have examples of people trying to fight back against the bureaucracy to implement their agenda, like Trump. So, Anyway, that's my thoughts. Sorry for my voice again. I know I sound like shit, but I had to make sure I got a podcast out today. I hope you thought my little breakdown on populism was good. I am the right wing populist, so I have to talk about populism at some point, right? Anyway, folks, that's it for today. Like I said, I'm not sure we'll be back tomorrow or not. Maybe it's gonna depend on my voice. If it's about the same, I'll either not do a podcast, or I'll do a much shorter version of the weekly wrap. We'll see. But before we go, again, please subscribe, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I'd really appreciate it. The podcast growth has been great the last couple of weeks, so keep supporting. We'll be back either tomorrow or next week, folks. Hope you have a good weekend. Bye-bye.